Snow blanketed the quiet town as Officer Mark Jensen prepared for another lonely night shift. The wind howled outside and the roads were empty, until a frantic scratching at his door broke the silence. When he opened it, his loyal German shepherd Rex stood there shivering, with something small and lifeless clutched gently in his jaws. Mark froze. It was a puppy, barely breathing, stiff with cold. Its tiny body was limp, eyes closed, clinging to life by a thread. In that moment, everything changed. He had seen tragedy before, but nothing like this. Because what began with a dying puppy on a doorstep would soon become a story that melted hearts across the world, and proved that sometimes the coldest nights create the warmest miracles. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The night was heavy with silence. Snow fell in soft, endless waves over the quiet mountain town, blanketing every rooftop, every streetlight, every sign of life in a shimmering coat of white. Inside a small cabin on the edge of town, Officer Mark Jensen sat by the window, a cup of steaming coffee in his hands, watching as the world outside disappeared beneath the storm. The faint hum of the police radio was the only sound breaking the stillness. He had grown used to nights like these, long, cold, and lonely. But tonight, something in the air felt different, like the world was holding its breath. By his feet lay Rex, his loyal German shepherd and former K9 partner. Even in retirement, Rex was alert, his ears twitching with every creak of the house, every whisper of wind. His fur shimmered in the firelight, his eyes reflecting both wisdom and warmth. Mark smiled faintly. "You still miss the field, don't you, buddy?" he said softly. Rex looked up, tail thumping once against the floor as if agreeing. They had been through everything together. Raids, rescues, nights of danger that tested every ounce of courage. But this quiet, was the hardest adjustment of all. Outside, the storm thickened. Wind howled against the windows, snow swirling like ghosts in the night. Mark glanced at the old clock on the wall, midnight. He set his coffee aside, stood and stretched, listening to the faint crackle of the fireplace. Rex rose too, pacing near the door, his tail stiff. "What's up?" Mark asked, his brow furrowing. Rex's nose lifted, sniffing the cold air seeping through the cracks. For a moment, Mark thought it was nothing, just the storm. But Rex's stance grew tense, his head cocked toward the window. The officer walked over, peered outside, but saw nothing but white. Still, Rex didn't move. His instincts were sharp, honed by years of service, and Mark had learned never to doubt them. He crouched beside his old partner, gently scratching behind his ears. "We'll check it out in the morning," he murmured. But Rex didn't relax. He let out a low, uneasy whine that made Mark's stomach tighten. Outside, beyond the flickering porch light, the storm raged harder. Somewhere in that blizzard, something was happening. Something only Rex could sense. And before the night was over, that instinct would lead them to a discovery that would change everything. The storm showed no mercy. By the time the clock struck 1, the town had vanished beneath a wall of snow. The streetlights outside Mark's cabin flickered weakly, their glow swallowed by the white curtain that swept across the land. Wind howled like a restless spirit, rattling the windows and shaking the door on its hinges. Inside, the fire burned low, casting long, trembling shadows across the wooden floor. The peaceful quiet of earlier had turned into something else, something tense, watchful, and uneasy. Mark tossed another log into the fireplace and rubbed his hands together. "We're not going anywhere tonight," he muttered, glancing toward Rex. The German shepherd stood near the front door, posture alert, eyes fixed on the swirling snow outside. His ears twitched, and every few seconds he gave a short, restless whine. "You hear something, don't you?" Mark asked quietly, watching him. Over the years, he had learned that Rex never acted without reason. The dog had saved his life more than once, spotting danger where no human could. Mark trusted those instincts more than anything. Still, in the middle of a storm like this, it seemed impossible that anything could be moving out there. He walked to the window and peered into the darkness. The porch light barely reached the edge of the steps, beyond which lay a blur of snow and shadows. He could see nothing, but Rex's low growl sent a chill through him. Somewhere out there, beyond the veil of white, something was happening. Mark grabbed his flashlight and jacket, preparing to step outside, but a violent gust of wind slammed against the door, howling like a warning. He hesitated, hand on the doorknob, heart pounding. All right, he sighed, backing away. We'll wait it out. Rex paced anxiously, tail stiff, eyes never leaving the window. Mark watched him for a long moment, unease settling deep in his chest. You're acting strange tonight, partner, he whispered. Oh, what are you trying to tell me? Hours crawled by. The storm raged, battering the cabin relentlessly, snow piling higher against the door. Mark tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, Rex's low, steady growl brought him back to full alert. Then, just before dawn, the wind began to die down. The silence that followed was eerie, too still, too quiet. Rex's ears perked suddenly, his body tense. Then came the sound, faint, desperate scratching at the front door. Mark froze. His breath caught. The storm might have ended, but something or someone was out there. And Rex had known all along. The sound came again, soft but frantic. Scratch, scratch, whimper. Mark's pulse quickened. Rex was already at the door, ears pinned forward, tail rigid, his body a tense silhouette against the flickering light of the fireplace. Snowflakes still drifted through the cracks, carried by the dying wind. But this sound was different. It wasn't the storm. It was alive. Mark grabbed his flashlight and approached cautiously. Easy, boy, he whispered, placing a steadying hand on Rex's back. The dog's muscles quivered under his touch. Another faint cry echoed, high-pitched, desperate, and fading. Mark's heart clenched. Is that? He didn't finish. Instinct took over. He turned the knob and pulled the door open. A blast of icy wind hit him full in the face. Snow swirled violently on the porch, and through the haze stood Rex, half buried in the drift, his fur dusted white. In his mouth he held something small and limp. For a heartbeat, Mark couldn't make sense of it. Then the flashlight beam caught the tiny shape. A puppy. Barely breathing, fur frozen stiff, eyes shut tight. Dear God, Mark whispered, stepping forward. Rex's eyes met his, pleading, urgent. The German shepherd carefully patted inside, setting the tiny bundle on the warm wooden floor. He let out a low whine and nudged the motionless pup with his nose. Mark dropped to his knees beside them. The puppy's body was cold, too cold. Its tiny chest barely moved. Where did you find this little one? He asked softly, but Rex only whimpered again, circling anxiously. Snow clung to his paws, proof that he'd been out there for some time. Mark realized then, Rex must have braved the entire storm alone to find this puppy. He scooped the frail creature into a towel and rushed it closer to the fire. His hands trembled as he rubbed the pup's sides, whispering, Come on, little one, don't give up on me now. Behind him, Rex stood guard, eyes fixed on the puppy, refusing to look away even for a second. Minutes stretched into eternity. The only sounds were the crackle of fire and the rhythmic whisper of Mark's voice urging life back into the tiny body. Then, barely audible, a weak whimper. The puppy twitched. Mark froze, disbelief flooding his face. Rex barked once, sharp and hopeful, his tail wagging for the first time that night. Against the odds, there was still a spark of life. But deep down, Mark knew. The battle wasn't over yet. The storm outside might have passed, but a far greater fight for survival had just begun. Mark's heart pounded as he pressed the tiny puppy closer to the fire. The towel around it was damp, its fur clinging to its fragile body. Every breath was shallow, barely there. Come on, little one. Stay with me, he whispered, his voice trembling. Rex paced beside him, tail down, eyes filled with worry. Every few seconds, the German shepherd nudged the towel gently, as if trying to lend his own warmth. Mark had seen countless emergencies during his years on the force, but nothing like this. This wasn't just about survival. It was about hope. The puppy's tiny body trembled once, then went still again. Mark's pulse spiked. He grabbed another towel from the rack, tossed it near the fire until it was warm, and wrapped it tightly around the pup. Rex, stay, he commanded softly, but Rex didn't move away. Instead, the dog sat closer, letting the faint heat of his body spread toward the motionless puppy. Steam rose faintly from the wet fur. Mark gently rubbed its chest with 2 fingers, mimicking CPR. Breathe, come on, breathe. His voice cracked under the weight of desperation. Minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. The snow outside kept falling, tapping faintly against the window. It was a cruel contrast, the world frozen in silence while life itself hung by a thread inside this small cabin. Finally, the faintest sound broke the stillness, a tiny gasp. Then another. The puppy's chest lifted ever so slightly. Mark froze in disbelief. There it is. he said hoarsely, his eyes wide. Rex whined softly, inching closer, his tail flicking in cautious excitement. Mark rubbed faster now, gently but firmly, feeding the puppy sips of warm water from his fingertips. Its paws twitched. Its eyes fluttered open for just a second, dull but alive. "Good boy. You're gonna make it," Mark whispered, tears forming at the corners of his eyes. Rex let out a deep sigh of relief, resting his head beside the towel, his nose brushing the puppy's side. It was as if he understood that the hardest part wasn't over yet, that they had only won the first battle. Mark glanced at the clock, 3:15 a.m. The vet's clinic was miles away, and the roads were buried under snow. He looked out the window, then back at the tiny bundle of life cradled in his arms. "If we wait until morning, he won't make it," he muttered. Rex lifted his head, eyes meeting his partner's as if saying, "Then we don't wait." Mark nodded. "All right, buddy. We're doing this together." He threw on his heavy jacket, wrapped the puppy securely against his chest, and grabbed the truck keys. Rex was already waiting at the door, ready to face the storm once more. As the door swung open, wind and snow rushed in, biting against their faces. Mark took one last look at the warmth behind him, the flickering firelight, and stepped into the darkness. "Hang on, little one," he whispered. "We're not losing you tonight." The truck's tires fought against the snow-covered road, skidding and growling with every turn. Mark leaned forward over the steering wheel, squinting through the windshield wipers that struggled to keep up. The storm had eased, but the air was still freezing, sharp enough to sting his lungs. In his arms, wrapped in layers of towels, the tiny puppy lay motionless. Only the faintest warmth pulsed beneath his palms. Rex sat in the passenger seat, restless, his nose pressed against the bundle in Mark's lap. Every few seconds, he let out a low whine, eyes darting between the road and the puppy. Mark could feel the dog's anxiety. It mirrored his own. "Hang in there, buddy," he muttered, both to Rex and the little one. "We're almost there." The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing a landscape buried in white. The nearest veterinary clinic was over 10 miles away, and the roads were barely passable. But turning back wasn't an option. Not after Rex had risked his life to bring this puppy home. At a red light, though no one else was on the road, Mark stopped for a moment, glancing down. The puppy's breathing was almost imperceptible. For one terrifying second, he thought it had stopped altogether. "No, no, no." His hands trembled as he rubbed the puppy's chest again, whispering, "Stay with me, little one. You've come this far." Rex whimpered louder, licking the edge of the towel as if trying to wake the tiny creature. Then, just as Mark's heart began to sink, a soft, weak sound emerged, a small whimper, barely audible but real. Mark froze. "Did you hear that?" he said, his voice breaking into a half-laugh, half-sob. Rex barked once, tail wagging faintly. Hope flickered inside the cab like the first light of dawn. Mark gently adjusted the towel, holding the puppy closer to his chest. He could feel its heartbeat, fragile but fighting. "That's it. That's it, little fighter," he whispered. The drive continued, but something inside Mark shifted. The fear that had gripped him began to melt into determination. The cold no longer mattered. The distance no longer frightened him. All that mattered now was reaching help before that tiny heartbeat faded again. Rex turned his head toward the window, ears perked, as if he too sensed the faint rhythm of life returning, and somewhere deep in the storm's fading echo, Mark swore he heard a promise, one that loyalty, courage, and love would see this little soul through the night. Snow whipped across the windshield like shards of glass as Mark's truck battled through the storm. The heater was on full blast, but the chill still crept into his bones. Every few minutes he checked the tiny bundle in his arms, still breathing but faint. The puppy's small chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm, fighting for life. Beside him, Rex sat rigid, his golden brown eyes locked on the trembling towel. He refused to look away, as if sheer willpower could keep the fragile creature alive. "Just hold on," Mark murmured, one hand gripping the steering wheel, the other cradling the puppy. "We're almost there." His headlights caught glimpses of the icy road ahead. Twisting turns, snowdrifts taller than the hood, and branches snapping under the weight of frost. The world outside was a blur of white chaos, yet inside that cab, the silence between man and dog was filled with unspoken determination. Mark's mind raced back to all the rescues he and Rex had pulled off together. Missing hikers, car crashes, even a child once trapped under rubble. Every time Rex had led the way, his instincts saving lives when human logic failed. But tonight felt different. There was no backup, no ambulance, no radio chatter, just a man, his dog, and a fading heartbeat in a towel. The truck's tires spun out suddenly, fishtailing on the ice. "Easy," Mark yelled, gripping the wheel tight. Rex barked, steadying himself with a paw on the dashboard. For a second, it felt like they'd lose control, but Mark managed to steer the truck back on track. His heart hammered in his chest. "You okay, buddy?" Rex gave a short whine, then looked back at the puppy, ears drooping in worry. The glowing sign of the veterinary clinic finally appeared through the snow, faint but unmistakable. Relief surged through Mark, but so did urgency. He slammed the brakes, pulled into the lot, and jumped out before the engine had even stopped. Rex leaped out right behind him, paws sinking into the snow. "Help! We need help!" Mark shouted, bursting through the clinic doors. The warmth of the building hit him like a wave. Startled staff turned toward him, their eyes widening at the sight. A uniformed officer with a trembling puppy in his arms and a police dog at his side. "She's freezing, barely breathing," Mark said, placing the bundle on the counter. The vet, a middle-aged woman with quick, gentle hands, took one look and sprang into action. "Get me warm fluids and a heating pad," she called to her assistant. Rex barked anxiously, pacing as they worked. His tail thumped once, twice, then stilled as he watched every move. Mark stood frozen, breath shallow, watching the team surround the table. For the first time that night, he wasn't in control. All he could do now was hope, and trust that Rex's act of courage hadn't been in vain. Outside, the storm continued to howl. But inside that clinic, warmth and life were fighting their way back, one heartbeat at a time. The veterinary clinic buzzed with urgent motion. The air smelled of antiseptic and warmth, a stark contrast to the freezing storm outside. Mark stood frozen near the door, his clothes soaked, breath ragged from the cold. His hands shook, not from the chill, but from fear. On the stainless steel table lay the tiny puppy, its fur still damp, chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm. "Temperature's dangerously low," said the vet. "Dr. Lewis," her voice calm but clipped with focus. "We'll need to raise it slowly or we'll lose him." Her assistant hurried to plug in heating pads, wrapping the pup in warm blankets while another prepared an IV of glucose solution. Rex stood beside Mark, his head tilted, eyes fixed on the tiny creature. Every sound, the clinking of instruments, the whir of the heat lamp, made his ears twitch. He whined softly, pacing the length of the room as if urging the humans to move faster. Mark took a step closer, gripping the edge of the table. "He's a fighter," he said hoarsely. "He made it through the storm." His voice cracked, carrying the weight of exhaustion and hope. Dr. Lewis gave him a quick glance. "Then let's help him finish the fight." Minutes crawled by in tense silence. The puppy's body was so small, so fragile, it barely dented the folds of the blanket. Every few seconds, his chest stuttered as if deciding whether to keep breathing. Dr. Lewis adjusted the IV line, her movement steady, eyes unwavering. "Come on, little one," she whispered. "You've got people rooting for you." Rex moved closer, resting his chin on the edge of the table. His breath fogged the steel surface, eyes never blinking. Mark reached down, brushing his fingers through Rex's fur. "He wouldn't give up on him," Mark murmured. "I can't either." Outside, the storm howled against the windows, but inside, time stood still. The rhythmic beep of the monitor became the heartbeat of the room. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the puppy's breathing deepened. His paws twitched. His tiny nose wrinkled as if catching the first real breath of warmth. Dr. Lewis smiled faintly. "That's it. You're coming back to us." She looked at Mark. "You might have just saved him." Mark exhaled shakily, not realizing he'd been holding his breath. He looked down at Rex, who wagged his tail weakly for the first time since the storm. "No," Mark said softly. "He did." Dr. Lewis chuckled under her breath, glancing at the dog. "Then we'll make sure the hero gets credit." As the clinic lights flickered against the frost-streaked windows, Mark felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Rex lay quietly beside the table, eyes half closed. Content that the little life he'd carried through the storm was still fighting. For the first time that night, the world outside didn't seem so cold. The hours dragged on, slow and silent as the storm outside began to fade. Inside the clinic, only the soft hum of machines and the steady crackle of the heater filled the room. Mark sat slumped in a chair by the wall, exhaustion etched into his face. His uniform was still damp, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. But his eyes never left the small recovery table across the room. There, under the warm glow of a heat lamp, the puppy slept, its breathing steadier now, its tiny chest rising and falling like the rhythm of a lullaby. Rex lay stretched out beside the table, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but alert. Every few minutes his ears twitched at the faint sound of the puppy's breaths, as if counting each one. Dr. Lewis moved quietly between equipment, checking readings, adjusting the IV, and noting progress. When she finally approached Mark, her voice was low and calm. "He's stabilizing," she said.
"He's not out of danger yet, but—"
"He's fighting." Mark nodded, relief flickering behind his tired eyes. "He's got a good teacher," he murmured, glancing at Rex. The dog's tail gave a faint wag. The vet smiled softly. "You should get some rest. It's been a long night," but Mark shook his head. "Not until I know he's safe." He leaned back in his chair, staring at the glowing heater as memories of the storm flooded his mind. The whiteout roads, Rex's whines, the frozen bundle at the door. It didn't feel real, like the kind of story people would tell but never believe. Yet here they were, alive because a dog's heart had refused to ignore a cry for help. Rex stirred, lifting his head to look at Mark. Their eyes met, a silent exchange of understanding. No words were needed. The bond between them had always been deeper than command or training. It was built on trust, loyalty, and love. Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. "You never stopped being a hero, did you?" he whispered. Rex blinked slowly, almost in response. The clock ticked past 5 a.m. Dawn's faint light began to seep through the frost-coated windows, turning the snow outside into gold. Mark stood, stretching stiff muscles, and walked over to the table. The puppy shifted slightly under the blanket, letting out a tiny sigh. Mark smiled for the first time that night. "Hang in there, little one. The hardest part's over." Outside, the storm had ended, but inside that small clinic, a miracle was just beginning. Morning crept softly over the snow-covered town, painting the world in pale gold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hush so complete it felt sacred. Through the frosted windows of the small clinic, sunlight filtered in, gentle, pure, and warm. Mark stirred from his chair, stiff from exhaustion. He blinked against the light and looked toward the recovery table. The puppy was still there, wrapped in a blanket, chest rising and falling in a calm rhythm. For a long moment he just watched, afraid to move, afraid the fragile peace might shatter. Dr. Lewis entered quietly, a faint smile softening her tired face. "You were right to stay," she whispered. "He made it through the night." Mark's heart skipped. "He's alive." She nodded. "And strong. His temperature's back to normal, and he's breathing on his own now." She adjusted the tiny blanket, her eyes shining. "That's one tough little fighter." Rex, who had been dozing near the table, lifted his head the moment he heard her voice. His ears perked, tail thumping weakly against the floor. He stood and pressed his nose gently against the edge of the blanket, sniffing the pup as if confirming the news himself. The puppy stirred, opening its eyes. Two tiny glimmers of life staring up at the world for the first time since the storm. It let out a soft, curious whimper, followed by a faint, shaky bark. Mark froze, emotion welling in his chest. "Hey there, little one," he said softly, his voice breaking with relief. "You did it." Rex leaned closer and gave the puppy a tender lick across the head. The sight made Mark's throat tighten. It wasn't just survival, it was connection. The strong saving the weak, the old teaching the new what it meant to fight for life. Dr. Lewis smiled as she watched the two dogs. "You know," she said, "it's rare for a rescue like this to happen. If your partner hadn't found him when he did." Mark nodded, unable to speak. He reached down, rubbing Rex's fur. "You knew, didn't you, buddy?" he whispered. "You always know." Rex gave a quiet huff, tail wagging faster now. Outside, the morning light shimmered on the snow, turning the world into a sea of diamonds. The storm had tested them all, but in its aftermath something pure had been reborn. Mark stood by the table watching the puppy snuggle closer to Rex. A faint smile crossed his face. "Welcome to the world, little miracle," he whispered. And for the first time in a long while, the cabin of his heart felt warm again. By noon, the snow had stopped completely, leaving the town blanketed in silence. The world outside the clinic glowed under the sun as if nothing had ever gone wrong. Inside, Warmth and life filled the small room. Rex resting peacefully on the floor, the puppy curled against his chest like it had always belonged there. Mark stood near the window, coffee in hand, watching them both with quiet wonder. Dr. Lewis finished jotting down notes on her clipboard. "He's recovering faster than I expected," she said with a smile. "Strong heart, no signs of frostbite. He just needs warmth and care." Mark nodded, his gaze still on the pup. "You think someone owned him?" She paused. "Hard to say. He's too young to have wandered that far on his own. But someone or something had to have been with him." The thought lingered in Mark's mind. Rex had found the puppy miles away from town in the middle of a deadly storm. That wasn't a place a newborn would survive alone. Something or someone had to be out there. Later that afternoon, Mark packed the puppy in a warm carrier and opened the clinic door. The crisp air bit his face, but the sun's warmth felt different now, gentler, almost forgiving. Rex trotted beside him, tail swaying, eyes bright. "All right, partner," Mark said softly, glancing down at his dog. "You found him. Think you can show me where?" Rex barked once, as if to say, "Follow me." They set out, the snow crunching under Mark's boots. The trail wasn't easy to find, but Rex moved with purpose, nose low, body steady. Every few yards he paused, sniffed, then pressed on. The town grew distant behind them, swallowed by trees heavy with frost. After nearly half an hour, Rex stopped at a cluster of fallen branches near the edge of the forest. He let out a low whine, circling a small mound of snow. Mark knelt, brushing it aside, and his breath caught. There, beneath the drift, was a small wooden crate half buried in ice. Inside, scraps of fabric and straw. Signs of life once sheltered there. Mark's chest tightened. "This is where you found him," he whispered. Rex whimpered softly, pressing his nose against the crate. Something about the scene felt sacred, like a story of survival written in snow and silence. Mark placed a hand on Rex's head. "You didn't just rescue him," he murmured. "You brought him home." The wind stirred gently through the trees, carrying with it the faint echo of life once lost but never forgotten. The forest stood silent beneath a canopy of snow-laden branches. The air was still, heavy with the kind of quiet that followed after tragedy. Mark crouched beside the half-buried crate, brushing away the last of the frost with his gloved hands. Inside lay the faint traces of a desperate struggle, torn fabric, bits of straw, paw prints frozen in ice. Rex stood beside him, tail lowered, eyes dark with understanding. Mark ran his flashlight across the ground. A faint trail of indentations led a few yards deeper into the woods. "Come on, buddy," he said softly. Rex moved ahead, nose close to the ground, following the scent with quiet determination. They wove between trees until Rex stopped abruptly, letting out a soft, mournful whine. Mark stepped closer and froze. There, half covered by snow, lay the body of an adult dog. A female, her fur matted, her body curled tightly around a hollow in the ground. It took only a second for Mark to understand. She had sheltered her puppy from the storm, shielding him until the end. Mark knelt beside her, his throat tightening. "Oh no," he whispered. The mother's eyes were closed, her expression peaceful, almost gentle, as if she'd known her sacrifice had meaning. The snow around her had formed a shallow cocoon, untouched by scavengers, as if nature itself had chosen to preserve her story. Rex approached quietly, his head low. He sniffed the mother dog gently, then sat beside her, ears pinned back. A soft whimper escaped him, a sound of respect, not sorrow alone. It was the same sound he'd made years ago when a fallen officer was honored at a final salute. Mark swallowed hard. "You found her baby," he said softly to Rex. "You finished what she started." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. Snowflakes drifted slowly from the trees, settling gently on the mother's fur like a white shroud. Mark took off his glove and placed a hand on her side. Her body was cold, but her story burned in his chest. "You were brave," he murmured. "You gave everything for him." Rex leaned forward, touching his nose to the lifeless paw. His breath steamed in the cold air, a silent farewell. Mark stood, blinking back the sting in his eyes. He removed his hat and bowed his head briefly. "Let's get her somewhere safe," he said quietly. "She deserves that much." Together they worked gently, carrying her from the frozen earth back toward the clearing. The puppy, nestled warm in Mark's jacket, stirred faintly, as if sensing the presence of the mother he'd never know. As they reached the edge of the forest, sunlight broke through the trees, a single golden beam touching the mother's fur. It was brief, but in that moment it felt like grace, a silent promise that her love had not been in vain. Mark glanced down at Rex, his voice barely a whisper. "You were her miracle," he said, "and now she's yours." The days that followed were filled with quiet healing. The storm had passed, the roads had cleared, and the town had returned to its steady rhythm. But for Mark and Rex, something had changed forever. The puppy now lived with them at the small cabin on the edge of town. The once silent home now echoed with soft whimpers, tiny barks, and the gentle tap of small paws on the wooden floor. Mark had named him Hope, a name that seemed to fit perfectly. Every time he spoke it, it reminded him of that frozen night, of the love that had endured even through death. Hope was small but fierce, full of life, his eyes bright with curiosity. From the very first morning, he followed Rex everywhere, tripping over his own paws, stumbling on rugs, and curling up beside Rex's tail whenever he tired. Rex, the seasoned protector, had taken to his new role without hesitation. He watched over the pup with quiet devotion, nuzzling him awake, guiding him to his food bowl, and gently correcting him with a soft paw when the little one grew too mischievous. At night, Rex would rest by the fireplace while Hope burrowed against his chest, breathing in rhythm with the heartbeat that had saved him. Mark often sat in his armchair, watching the two of them together. There was something deeply healing about it. After years of chasing danger, after loss and loneliness, life had finally given him something pure again. "You brought him home for a reason," he said one evening, glancing at Rex. "Maybe we both needed him." The dog looked up, eyes wise and knowing, and gave a single slow wag of his tail. Outside, the world glittered beneath the winter sun. The snow was no longer harsh, it looked softer now, alive with light. Hope's small prints trailed beside Rex's in the yard, two paths winding through the white. Every day they ventured a little farther, exploring, learning, growing together. When neighbors visited, they couldn't help but smile at the sight. Rex standing tall and noble, the little puppy darting between his legs like a shadow that refused to be left behind. Life, Mark realized, had a strange way of mending broken hearts. Sometimes it sent storms, sometimes it sent miracles disguised as strays. That night, as the fire crackled and Hope drifted to sleep beside his guardian, Mark whispered, "Rest easy, little one. You're safe now." And for the first time in a long while, the cabin felt complete, filled not just with warmth, but with purpose. It started with a single photograph, a snapshot taken by Dr. Lewis at the clinic. In it, Rex sat proudly beside the recovery table, his paw resting protectively near the tiny puppy bundled in blankets. The caption read, "A retired police canine braved a blizzard to save a frozen puppy. Some heroes wear fur." She posted it online, not thinking much of it, but by morning it had spread like wildfire. Within hours, local news stations picked up the story. By noon, national headlines followed. Police officer's dog rescues frozen puppy in winter storm. The image of Rex and Hope touched millions. People from around the world commented, sharing messages of love, admiration, and tears. Faith in humanity restored. This made my day. Rex deserves a medal. Mark was stunned. His phone buzzed nonstop, calls from reporters, messages from strangers, even letters arriving at the police station addressed to Rex, the hero dog. The small town that had once been quiet now found itself on every social media feed, but through it all, Mark stayed humble. "Rex doesn't need fame," he told a reporter. "He just did what he's always done. Protect life." One evening, as Mark scrolled through the thousands of comments, he noticed a message that stopped him cold. It was from a woman who lived in a nearby county. Her voice message was soft, trembling. "That puppy. I think I know where he came from. A stray mother dog had been living behind our barn for weeks. We tried to find her during the storm, but we were too late. Please tell Rex thank you for saving her baby." Mark's eyes misted. He set the phone down and looked across the room. Rex and Hope were curled up together by the fire, the old warrior and the life he'd saved. He smiled. "Looks like the world finally knows what I've known all along," he said quietly. "You're one in a million, partner." Rex lifted his head, tail thumping lazily against the floor. Hope stirred beside him, yawning before snuggling closer. Outside, snowflakes drifted gently past the window. Inside, warmth and peace filled the cabin. Fame didn't matter. What mattered was the bond, the story of courage, love, and second chances that had touched hearts far beyond their little town. And somewhere out there, a mother's sacrifice had not been forgotten. Weeks passed, and life slowly settled into a calm rhythm again. The storms had faded into memory, replaced by crisp mornings and clear blue skies. Mark's cabin, once quiet and solitary, now buzzed with life. Every dawn began the same way, Rex standing alert by the door, tail wagging, and Hope tumbling at his paws, eager to follow his every move. Mark would sip his coffee by the window, watching them chase each other through the frosted yard. The sight never failed to bring a smile to his face. "You two are trouble," he'd joke, but his voice always carried warmth. The house that had once echoed with silence was now alive with barks, laughter, and the comforting sound of belonging. Hope was growing fast. His once tiny paws now left deeper prints in the snow, his fur thicker, his steps more confident. Rex had become his teacher, patient, steady, and wise. He showed Hope how to track scents, respond to commands, and, most importantly, when to listen. Watching them together reminded Mark of his own training days with Rex years ago. The trust, the bond, the unspoken language between them. Sometimes, Mark would take them both into town. The people recognized Rex instantly, the hero from the viral story. Children would run up to pet him, while Hope, ever curious, would wag his tail and lick every hand in reach. Mark often laughed at the sight, thinking how life had come full circle. At night, as the fire crackled, Mark often found himself reflecting. The storm had changed him too. It reminded him that heroism isn't always found in grand gestures. It often lives in quiet moments of compassion. Rex had taught him that once on duty, and he had taught him again in retirement. One evening, as the golden glow from the fire danced across the room, Mark looked at his two dogs lying side by side. Hope had one paw draped over Rex's, fast asleep. The older dog's eyes met Mark's, calm and content. "You've done your part, old friend," Mark whispered, "and now he'll carry it forward." Rex gave a slow blink, the kind that spoke volumes without words. Outside, the snow fell lightly again, but this time, it wasn't a storm. It was peace. Winter slowly melted into spring, and the once frozen world bloomed with color again. The snow that had buried everything in silence was gone, replaced by fields of green and the distant hum of life returning. For Mark, it felt like a quiet rebirth, a second chance not just for the puppy they'd saved, but for himself as well. One morning, sunlight spilled through the cabin window, painting everything in gold. Mark sat by the fireplace, sipping his coffee, while Rex and Hope played near the yard. The sight was pure poetry. Hope chasing after Rex's tail, barking with puppyish determination while Rex pretended to lose the game just to make him happy. Every once in a while, Rex would stop and nudge the pup gently with his nose, guiding him back whenever he strayed too far. Mark smiled, the warmth of the moment filling his chest. He reached for an old photo frame on the mantel, a picture of him and Rex from their police days. Both of them stood tall, medals gleaming, eyes sharp and proud. "You've always been my best partner," he murmured, tracing his thumb across the glass. "But what you did this winter, that was something beyond duty." Rex lifted his head as if he'd heard, eyes steady and filled with the same loyalty that had carried them through years of service. Hope trotted over, curling up between them, resting his head on Rex's paw. The sight melted every remaining shadow of loneliness inside Mark's heart. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark built a fire outside the cabin. He sat in his old wooden chair, Rex lying beside him, Hope stretched out near the flames. The sky glowed in hues of orange and pink, and the first stars began to shimmer. The moment felt timeless. Mark's mind drifted back to the night of the storm, the scratching at the door, the lifeless puppy, the desperate drive through darkness. It all seemed like a lifetime ago, yet here they were, alive, safe, and whole. He exhaled slowly, his breath catching in the cool evening air. "You saved him, Rex," he said softly. "And maybe in a way you saved me too." Rex turned, resting his head on Mark's knee. His fur shimmered in the firelight, silver streaks glinting like medals of age and honor. Hope stirred beside them, letting out a sleepy sigh. Mark looked toward the stars. Somewhere up there, he hoped, the mother dog was watching, her sacrifice not forgotten, her love living on through the puppy she'd protected and the hero who had carried him home. He raised his cup gently toward the sky. "For you," he whispered. "For every heart that never stops caring." Rex's tail thumped once against the ground. As the fire crackled softly, Mark leaned back, surrounded by the sound of peace, the deep breathing of his loyal companion, the faint puppy snores and the gentle whisper of wind through the trees. "Sometimes," he said, almost to himself, "heroes wear badges. And sometimes they wear fur." The stars above shimmered brighter as if agreeing, and in that quiet golden glow, love, loyalty, and hope lived on.